Why did the room go quiet the moment they pressed her against the wall? Like the air itself knew something the men did. They thought they were cornering her. That was the part that almost made her smile, though her face never moved. Lieutenant Raina Corso stood with her back to cool concrete, Master Chief Holloway's hand firm on her shoulder during that first instructor briefing, his grip less about balance and more about ownership. A warning. A signal. Around them, the men kept talking as if she wasn't there, as if she were another piece of furniture dragged in to satisfy a requirement no one respected. To them, she was just a woman in a Navy uniform that fit too cleanly, an intelligence officer with a neat haircut and nothing to prove. They didn't see the compass rose tattooed behind her left ear. They didn't know what it cost. They didn't hear the echo of gunfire that still lived there. The Pacific fog rolled in thick at dawn, swallowing the Naval Special Warfare Center in gray. Raina stood at the edge of the obstacle field, hands clasped behind her back, watching trainees fight the mud like it was personal. The air tasted of salt and diesel. Her uniform was crisp, almost too crisp, but her boots were scarred in ways that didn't come from training grounds, places without names, nights that never made it into reports. She watched a young trainee muscle his way over a rope wall, all strength and no efficiency, and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. He was burning energy he didn't know he'd need later. Poor fundamentals. Fixable. No one asked her opinion. Holloway talked around her, not to her. Another instructor joked about the weather. Someone mentioned weekend liberty. Raina said nothing. Silence had kept her alive before. It could do it again. Her fingers brushed the skin behind her ear, finding the tattoo without conscious thought. She breathed in slowly, steadying herself. These men thought they understood hardship. They had no idea what she'd already survived to stand here. New text document. Why did the memories always come back when she was being underestimated? She grew up in the shadow of a fence line in 29 Palms, where the desert stretched forever and the air shimmered with heat. Her father came home every night smelling of gun oil and sand, a Marine who believed words were tools to be used sparingly. He taught her to shoot when she was 9, not gently, not ceremonially. Correct or don't bother. By 12, she could strip a rifle blindfolded. She joined the Navy at 18 because it would teach her how to think. Intelligence suited her. Patterns, signals, quiet rooms where decisions were made far from the noise. She was good enough to be trusted early, good enough to sit in briefings where names didn't matter and call signs did. Then came Mosul, October, an operation that was supposed to be simple until it was. The building swallowed them, floor by floor, hour by hour. When the interpreter went down and the radios crackled with voices she understood too well, fear became something else, sharp, useful. She wasn't there to fight, but war doesn't respect job descriptions. She remembered the weight of the rifle shoved into her hands, the sound of breathing that wasn't going to last. Aaron Brooks bleeding out on tile, his hand gripping hers like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She remembered the promise because promises made to the dying carved themselves into bone. "If you walk out of this," he'd whispered, "don't waste it." She walked out, 4 others didn't. The compass rose came later. North, south, east, west. 4 directions, 4 names. Why did people think silence meant weakness? The first live fire drill answered that question. They talked to her slowly, carefully, as if volume might help comprehension. She watched through ballistic glass while trainees ran scenarios that would get them killed in real rooms. When one team botched an entry, she spoke once over the radio, calm, precise. The problem wasn't awareness. It was balance. Fix the stance, fix the scan. The response was immediate and cold. Observation only. She heard the laughter later, heard the bets placed on her failure. She sat alone in her quarters that night, hands trembling just enough to notice. Isolation didn't scare her. Waste did. These trainees deserved better than noise masquerading as instruction. She took out the photograph she carried too long, 4 figures in dust and exhaustion. She studied Brooks's grin until the room felt smaller. Don't waste it. She didn't cry, she planned. Men who felt threatened followed patterns, predictable ones. Why did the test feel less like evaluation and more like punishment? Holloway called it standardization, validation, words that sounded clean. The course was anything but land navigation designed to exhaust, a shoot house meant to expose hesitation, medical scenarios stacked back to back, a ruck march waiting at the end like a final question mark. She met each task the same way she'd met worse, by breaking it down until fear had nowhere to hide. The terrain tore at her legs. The map lied once. She corrected without complaint. In the shoot house, she moved like memory itself, angles and geometry solving problems before doubt could form. The medical station blurred into muscle memory and doctrine spoken aloud. By the time the ruck march began, pain had settled into her bones. Holloway offered her an exit. No shame, he said. She didn't answer. She just lifted the weight and moved forward. At mile 10, they added one more task. A casualty, dead weight, brush that fought back. She understood exactly what it was meant to do, make her quit where witnesses could see. She didn't quit, she dragged, inch by inch, promise by promise. Why did everything change when the scar showed? When she finally stood in front of them, bleeding and shaking, Holloway started reading from his clipboard. Barely passed. Minimum standards. Words meant to shrink what she'd done. Then her sleeve shifted. The scar spoke louder than she ever had. Mosul, October 2017, Old City. Recognition hit like a physical blow. Silence swallowed the space between them. For the first time, she saw uncertainty in Holloway's eyes. She told them why she was there, not to prove herself, to keep a promise. Approval didn't matter. Worth wasn't granted by men who hadn't been there. She walked away before they could find the words. Why did respect arrive only after suffering was visible? By Monday, the tone had changed. Quiet but different. Her name carried weight now. She took her place not as a curiosity but as an instructor whose voice mattered. When she spoke, adjustments happened. When trainees ran again, they ran cleaner. Holloway apologized without excuses. She accepted without ceremony. It was enough. That night alone with the photograph in the dim light, the promise felt lighter. Not gone, just carried with purpose. The compass rose caught the glow. 4 directions, 4 reasons to keep going. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why did the silence after Mosul feel louder than the gunfire ever had? Raina learned quickly that surviving a fight was only the beginning. What came after was quieter, slower, and somehow heavier. The debrief rooms were clean and cold, lit by screens and careful language. People spoke in acronyms and passive voice as if distance could soften what had happened. She answered questions calmly, accurately, leaving emotion out because no one had asked for it. No one ever did. At night, it came back anyway. The smell of dust. The way the building breathed around them, walls popping from heat and pressure. The radio calls that went unanswered just long enough to make hope dangerous. She'd wake with her jaw clenched, fingers curled as if still gripping a rifle that wasn't hers. She learned to sit up slowly, feet flat on the floor, name 5 things she could see, 4 she could hear. Grounding, they called it. She called it surviving the quiet. When emergency leave came, she didn't go home right away. She drove instead, no destination at first, just movement. San Diego eventually. A small tattoo shop near the water, clean and quiet. The artist asked if she was sure about the design. She nodded once. North, south, east, west. 4 points. 4 faces she carried whether she wanted to or not. When the needle bit, she welcomed the pain. It was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. Back in uniform, the Navy tried to put her back where she'd been before. Screens, analysis, controlled environments. She lasted 6 weeks. Every time she watched a team prep for a mission, every time she saw names scroll across a tasking order, she felt something tighten. Knowledge without proximity felt like betrayal. Brooks's voice came back uninvited. Don't waste it. So she asked, formally, in writing, for a path that didn't really exist. Naval special warfare wasn't enthusiastic. They were practical. They asked what she thought she could offer that they didn't already have. She didn't talk about bravery. She talked about mistakes, about how small errors multiplied in close quarters, about what happened when intelligence stayed theoretical instead of living in the same rooms as shooters. She talked about Mosul without embellishment, without asking for sympathy. They said yes slowly, with caveats, with conditions. The training that followed wasn't designed for people like her. That was the point. Courses that sat in gray areas between support and operator, places where expectations were deliberately unclear. She learned how to move under load without being noticed, how to treat injuries in spaces too tight to kneel, how to endure discomfort without letting it leak into decision-making. She learned how to be quiet when being loud would feel better. She failed some evolutions quietly. She learned from them. Nobody congratulated her when she succeeded. She didn't need them to. By the time orders came for the instructor billet, she was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. But she said yes immediately. Promises weren't optional. Why did arriving feel harder than leaving ever had? The Naval Special Warfare Center was immaculate in its own way. Orderly, controlled, a place built on reputation and repetition. Raina arrived with a sea bag and a set of orders that labeled her as support. That word followed her like a shadow. Support meant adjacent. Support meant acceptable but never central. Master Chief Holloway embodied the place, the confidence, the history. She recognized it instantly because she'd seen versions of it before, men forged by years of doing impossible things, carrying pride like armor. She also recognized the fracture points. Everyone had them. From the start, he didn't see her, or rather he saw something else, a policy, an idea imposed from above. Every glance slid past her as if engagement might validate something he didn't want to accept. She kept her posture perfect, her voice neutral, her opinions unoffered unless directly asked. They almost never were. At night, alone in quarters that smelled faintly of disinfectant, doubt crept in. Not about her capability, about her impact. Was she actually helping anyone here or just enduring another kind of silence? She took the photo out again, traced the edge with her thumb. Purpose wasn't about comfort. She knew that. Still, the human part of her wanted acknowledgement that she existed. She packed and unpacked her sea bag without realizing she was doing it. Old habits, readiness masquerading as control. Why did being ignored hurt more than open hostility? The days settled into a rhythm of observation. She watched trainees push themselves past reason, watched instructors default to volume when nuance would have served better. She took mental notes, not judgments, data. When she spoke once over the radio, she did it because the error mattered. The response stung anyway. That night, overhearing laughter, she felt something crack, not loudly but enough to notice. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. She hoped, irrationally, that experience might count for something without being displayed like a scar. She let herself feel it for exactly 10 minutes, sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, breath shallow. Then she did what she'd learned to do in worse places. She analyzed threats, motivations, patterns. Holloway wasn't malicious. He was defensive. Defensive people escalated when they felt exposed. She wrote it all down, not to vent, to prepare. Why did preparation feel like confession? The notebook became a place for clarity. She mapped personalities the way she used to map neighborhoods, who followed Holloway without question, who deferred to Voss's silence, who watched her with curiosity instead of contempt. She tracked trainees, too, the ones who listened, the ones who compensated with bravado, the ones who might survive if someone reached them in time. By the time Holloway announced the validation exercise, she wasn't surprised. The only uncertainty was how far he'd go. The answer, it turned out, was far enough. She didn't argue. Arguing would frame it as fear. She said she'd be ready and meant it. The night before, she slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments, a hallway, a door that wouldn't open, Brooks's voice without words. She woke before the alarm, heart steady but heavy. She dressed carefully, methodically, checked her gear twice, not because she doubted herself, because details mattered. Standing at the start point, full load settling onto old injuries, she felt the familiar narrowing, focus stripping away everything unnecessary. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about not betraying the dead. Why did pain feel like an old language she still spoke fluently? The land navigation course pulled at muscles she hadn't tested like this in years. Her shoulder protested early, a dull burn that grew sharper with every climb. She adjusted her pace, not slowing, just redistributing effort. When she found the incorrect grid, she didn't curse. She adapted. Real terrain didn't care about perfect plans. By the time she reached the final checkpoint, sweat soaked her collar and her calves trembled when she stopped moving. She didn't stop long. At the shoot house, something shifted. Familiarity wrapped around her like muscle memory. The sounds, the angles, the way time stretched and compressed. She moved without hurry, without waste. When it was over, she felt no triumph, just relief. Relief that her hands still knew what to do. As the day wore on, fatigue settled deep. Not dramatic, persistent. When Holloway spoke to her before the ruck march offering an exit, she recognized it for what it was, not kindness, a test of resolve. She lifted the weight and stepped forward. Because some promises don't allow for shortcuts. Why did her body start to betray her right when quitting would have been easiest? The first mile of the ruck march felt almost merciful, pavement underfoot, a steady horizon, pain contained enough to negotiate with. Raina locked her pace into something mechanical, letting rhythm do the thinking her mind no longer wanted to. 15-minute miles weren't impressive on paper, but under load, under scrutiny, they became a language of endurance. She spoke it fluently. By mile 3, the mercy ended. The road gave way to dirt, then to uneven ground that shifted just enough to demand constant correction. The ruck straps gnawed at her shoulders, digging into tissue that never quite healed right. Each step sent a dull shock up through her spine. She adjusted again. Micro-corrections learned the hard way. Change the angle, change the breathing, keep the pressure from settling in one place too long. She didn't look back at the vehicle following 50 meters behind. She could feel it there anyway. The weight of eyes, the unspoken waiting. People always waited for the moment someone broke. It justified too many things. At mile 4, her vision narrowed slightly. Not enough to alarm her, but enough to register. She lengthened her exhale, slowed her heart. Panic was loud. Control was quiet. She thought about Mosul without meaning to. Not the violence, the waiting, hours where nothing happened and everything could. The way time stretched until it felt unreal. She remembered telling herself then that she only had to make it to the next minute, then the next. She applied the same math now, one step, then another. By mile 7, nausea crept in, sour and insistent. Her mouth filled with saliva she had to swallow back. She focused on the sound of her boots instead. Crunch, slide, crunch, a metronome that didn't care how she felt. Rain stayed close on foot, his presence a quiet shadow. He hadn't said much all day. She didn't know if that was respect or curiosity, and she didn't have the energy to care. When the vehicle finally stopped and Holloway stepped out, she knew before he spoke that the rules had changed again. Why did the hardest tests always come disguised as just one more thing? He told her about the casualty as if it were routine. Half a kilometer off trail. Assessment. 9-line medevac, 20 minutes. The tone was neutral, professional. The setup was. She followed his gesture to the brush-covered hillside and nodded once. Words were expensive now. She adjusted her straps and stepped off the trail, letting vegetation tear at her sleeves and shins. Every incline felt steeper than it should have been. Her legs responded with a heaviness that bordered on mutiny. She found the dummy where he said it would be. 180 pounds of dead weight dressed in familiar gear. She knelt, breath ragged now, and forced her hands to be precise. Assessment, airway, breathing, circulation. She called the 9 line cleanly, correcting herself when Holloway challenged the grid. Pride had no place here. Accuracy did. When he told her to bring the casualty back, the truth settled in fully. This wasn't evaluation, it was attrition. For a moment, just a flicker, resentment rose. Not anger, something colder. The knowledge that this had been designed not to measure competence but to manufacture failure. She let the feeling exist without feeding it. Emotion was information, not instruction. She rigged the drag harness with hands that shook despite her efforts. The first pull nearly pitched her forward. She adjusted her stance, leaned back, and pulled again. The dummy resisted like the ground itself had decided to fight her. Every meter was a negotiation. Her thoughts narrowed to sensation, the burn in her thighs, the tearing pain in her palms, the sound of her own breathing, harsh and unfamiliar. Time lost meaning. Distance became abstract. She focused on the next patch of dirt, then the next. At some point, tears mixed with sweat without ceremony. She didn't sob, she didn't slow. Crying took less energy than screaming. Why did she keep going when there was no one left to impress? Brooks's face surfaced without warning. Not dying, alive. Laughing at something stupid, helmet crooked, eyes bright in a way that felt impossible now. She remembered the weight of his hand in hers, the way his grip had weakened and then gone still. The promise hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't needed to be. She pulled. Her hand split open somewhere along the way. She noticed only because the blood made the rope slick. She adjusted her grip, welcomed the sting. Pain anchored her to the present. As long as she could feel it, she was still here. When she finally dragged the dummy back into view of the trail, her legs buckled. She caught herself by sheer refusal to fall. She dropped the weight at Holloway's feet and stood there, swaying, waiting. Breath came in broken pieces now, chest heaving like it belonged to someone else. He told her to finish the last 2 miles. She didn't argue, she didn't nod. She just turned and walked. Why couldn't she remember the end, even later? The last miles dissolved into fragments, asphalt under boots, the sun burning through the marine layer just enough to sting her eyes. Her body moved without consultation, driven by something older than willpower. Training, habit, the part of her that didn't ask permission to survive. When she crossed the finish marker, she didn't stop right away. Momentum carried her forward until gravity finally won. She sat hard on the road, ruck still on, head bowed, fighting the urge to be sick. The world narrowed to breath and pulse. Footsteps approached, voices floated indistinct. She focused on not passing out. Holloway read from the clipboard, barely passed, acceptable, minimum standards, words stacked carefully to diminish what had happened. She listened without reacting, the way she'd listened to worse news delivered with better phrasing. Then she wiped her face. The sleeve shift was accidental, the exposure was. She felt the air change before anyone spoke. That instinct hadn't dulled. She followed Holloway's gaze to the scar, pale and puckered against flushed skin. Recognition didn't hit him immediately. Confusion came first, then calculation, then something like dread. When she said Mosul, October 2017, it wasn't accusation. It was fact. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against her ears. Voss's face drained of color. He knew. Everyone who mattered knew that operation. The reports, the annexes, the names. She stood slowly, joints protesting, and shrugged out of the ruck. When she spoke, her voice was steady not because she wasn't exhausted, but because this was bedrock. This was truth she didn't have to embellish. She told them why she was there. She told them whose hand she'd held. She told them she didn't need permission to know her worth. And when she asked if there was anything else required of her, it wasn't defiance. It was closure. Why did walking away feel heavier than staying ever had? She left without waiting for an answer. Each step toward the barracks felt unreal, like moving through water. Behind her, voices rose, urgent, corrective, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to see it. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the silence followed her now, not dismissive but stunned. In her quarters, she finally let herself sit, not collapse, sit. She cleaned her hands methodically, watching diluted blood swirl down the drain. The mirror showed someone older than she remembered, eyes rimmed red, face hollowed by effort. Still standing. She took out the photograph again, set it on the desk. For the first time since Mosul, the weight in her chest eased just enough to notice. She hadn't wasted it. Not today. Why did the aftermath feel more dangerous than the trial itself? Monday arrived without ceremony, the way important things often did. Raina walked into the team room expecting tension, maybe hostility sharpened by embarrassment. What she found instead was something quieter and harder to name. Awareness. Conversation stalled when she entered, not because she was unwelcome, but because people were recalibrating. Master Chief Holloway stood at the head of the table, posture unchanged, authority intact. But his eyes followed her this time. He didn't look away. He didn't look past her. When he assigned roles for the coming training block, her name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Primary instructor, effective immediately. No applause, no commentary, just acknowledgement. She nodded once and took her seat. Her hands were steady. Inside, something else loosened, only slightly, like a knot that had been pulled on for too long and finally gave. As the briefing moved on, she listened with a different kind of focus, not defensive now, evaluative. She noticed how Holloway's tone shifted when he spoke about standards, how Voss deferred less automatically, how a few instructors stole glances at her notes. None of it felt like victory. It felt like gravity reasserting itself, things falling into their proper places. Why did respect always arrive so quietly? In the days that followed, the change spread in subtle ways. Radios clicked in her direction when questions arose about room flow or intelligence overlays. Trainees looked at her longer, not with doubt, but with intent, as if trying to understand what she saw that they didn't yet. She gave them what she could without posturing. Corrections delivered low and specific. Praise rare, but precise when earned. Holloway watched, sometimes from across the range, sometimes from beside her in the observation booth. He didn't interrupt. When he repeated her guidance over the radio, he didn't attribute it. He didn't need to. The results spoke fast, cleaner entries, fewer wasted movements, less noise for the sake of noise. One afternoon, between evolutions, Holloway stayed behind while the others cleared out. The shoot house stood empty beyond the glass, cardboard targets pocked and still. He kept his eyes forward when he spoke, voice lower than she'd ever heard it. He said he'd requested the full after-action from Mosul, all of it, the pieces that never made it into summary slides. He said he hadn't known, wouldn't have without someone pulling the records. She let the silence stretch before answering. The tattoo behind her ear felt warm under her fingers. She told him it didn't matter what he'd known then. What mattered was what he did now, with the trainees, with the standards, with the people who didn't look like his expectations. He nodded once. No excuses, no justifications, just acknowledgement. It was enough. Why did forgiveness feel less like release and more like acceptance? Her orders came 10 days later, permanent assignment, 2 years minimum, option to extend. Holloway's endorsement sat at the bottom, clean and unqualified. She read it once, then folded the paper and set it aside. Paperwork had never been the point. The first time she stood alone at the front of the shoot house as the primary instructor, she felt a familiar tightening, not fear but responsibility. 18 trainees watched her, some exhausted, some defiant, all standing on the edge of something they didn't yet understand. She didn't tell them war stories. She didn't need to. She talked about angles, about balance, about how the body lied under stress and how to correct for it. She talked about silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of waste. They listened. One trainee asked her later why she was so calm. She thought about the answer longer than he probably expected. Then she said the truth, because panic was expensive and they couldn't afford it. Why did teaching feel heavier than doing ever had? At night, alone again in quarters she still hadn't made her own, the weight of it all returned in smaller ways. The ache in her shoulder, the blisters healing poorly, the dreams that came less often now but with sharper edges. She didn't unpack, she probably never would. Comfort had always felt temporary. She sat at the desk with the photograph beside her. For the first time she spoke Brooks's name out loud in weeks. It didn't hurt less. It hurt differently. Purpose changed pain. It didn't erase it. She wrote letters she never sent, to his family, to the others, words she didn't need anyone else to read. When she finished, she tore them up carefully and threw them away. Some things existed only to be acknowledged, not shared. Why did leadership reveal itself in moments no one applauded? Weeks passed. The training cycle tightened. Trainees failed. Some quit. Some adapted. She watched them learn to sit with discomfort instead of fighting it. She corrected Holloway once when he slipped back into old habits, raised voice, broad criticism. He caught himself, adjusted. That mattered more than an apology ever could. One afternoon, a trainee froze in a room, overwhelmed by noise and motion. Raina stepped in, physically placing herself between him and the chaos. She didn't yell. She grounded him. Breathe. Find the wall. Reset. When it was over, the trainee's hands shook. He thanked her quietly. She told him he'd done the hard part already by staying. Why did redemption never look the way movies promised? At the end of the quarter, the remaining trainees stood in formation, thinner, harder, quieter. When her name was read as their primary instructor for the next phase, several of them looked directly at her, not with reverence, with understanding. She held their gaze without flinching. That night back in her darkened quarters, she finally allowed herself a small concession. She unpacked the photograph and set it in a place where she could see it without searching. The promise felt different now, still heavy, still sacred, but no longer lonely. She lay back on the narrow bed, listening to the distant hum of the bass settling for the night. Tomorrow would bring new mistakes, new chances to prevent them. That was the work. Sometimes strength wasn't loud. Sometimes it was just showing up again, willing to carry what others couldn't see. Why did the quiet victories feel heavier than the visible ones ever had? The weeks blurred into a rhythm that didn't ask how she felt. Training days bled into evenings of notes and after-action reviews, the kind that mattered because no one would ever see them. Raina learned the weight of being the last voice in a trainee's head before sleep, the one that corrected something small that might someday save a life. She learned how much restraint it took not to overteach, not to pour everything she knew into bodies that weren't ready to carry it yet. Some nights she left the shoot house with her throat raw from speaking just above a whisper all day. Silence was a tool now, not a refuge. She used it carefully. The trainees changed, not dramatically, gradually. They stopped charging doors like momentum alone could solve fear. They learned to pause without freezing, to breathe without broadcasting panic. She watched those shifts with a quiet pride that surprised her. Pride had always felt dangerous, like inviting loss. Now it felt earned, cautious, but real. Holloway changed too. Not in ways that made for stories. He didn't soften. He didn't suddenly become generous with praise. What changed was where he listened. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. He waited. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt. That kind of respect was rare in places built on hierarchy. She noticed it more than she let on. Why did leadership feel lonelier the higher she stood? Being right carried weight. Every correction she made became doctrine by repetition. When something went wrong, eyes turned to her, not accusing but searching. She felt the responsibility settle deeper each day. In Mosul, decisions had been immediate, visceral. Here, they echoed forward into futures she'd never see. One afternoon, a trainee failed catastrophically. Not unsafe, but lost. Overwhelmed by stimuli, he shut down in a way that no amount of yelling could fix. The cadre moved to pull him. Standard procedure. Raina asked for 5 minutes. They gave her 2. She sat with him in the corner of the range, both of them in full kit, sweat drying on their skin. She didn't ask him why he froze. She told him about breathing when your body lies to you, about how fear doesn't mean stop, it means narrow. When he nodded barely, she sent him back in. He didn't perform perfectly, he performed better, enough. That night she lay awake longer than usual, wondering if she'd overstepped, wondering if the line between compassion and standards was thinner than anyone admitted. She decided she'd walk it anyway. Someone had to. Why did the memories come back when she finally felt useful? They returned without warning. A smell of burned powder from a training blank. The echo of boots on concrete that sounded too much like that hallway. She found herself pressing her tongue to the roof of her mouth, grounding, counting breaths the way she used to count minutes in the dark. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Trauma didn't require an audience. Instead, she adjusted her schedule, more daylight runs, less caffeine late. She visited the medical clinic once quietly for her shoulder. The corpsman didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The scar still ached when the weather changed. She let it. Pain was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything else. Why did the promise feel different now? One evening she stayed late, rewriting a training scenario that had bothered her all day. It assumed perfect information. It assumed clean choices. She tore it apart and rebuilt it with uncertainty woven in. Missing intel. Conflicting reports. A civilian who didn't behave predictably. She imagined Brooks watching over her shoulder, shaking his head at the first draft, nodding at the second. The thought didn't hurt the way it used to. It steadied her. When the scenario ran the next week, it exposed weaknesses the old version never would have. The trainees struggled. They learned. That was the point. Holloway reviewed the results and said simply that it was better. Coming from him, it felt like a medal. Why did healing never announce itself? It came in fragments, in the way she no longer flinched at sudden noise, in the way she slept through the night more often than not, in the way she could say Masul out loud without her chest tightening like a fist. She still carried the photograph. She always would, but it felt less like a wound and more like a compass, direction instead of weight. Near the end of the cycle, a trainee approached her after hours. He didn't thank her. He didn't gush. He said he understood now why details mattered, why quiet mattered. Then he left. She sat alone in the shoot house after that, lights low, targets down. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence she'd helped create. Not empty, intentional. Why did staying feel braver than leaving ever had? Orders came for others. Rotations ended. People moved on. She stayed. The work wasn't finished and maybe it never would be. That was okay. In her quarters, she finally unpacked a little more. Not everything. Just enough to admit she wasn't leaving tomorrow. The photograph stayed on the desk. The compass rose behind her ear, caught the light when she turned her head. She thought about the woman who'd stood against a wall on her first day, unseen and underestimated. She didn't feel angry toward her. She felt protective. That woman had endured. This one was building. Sometimes redemption wasn't about being forgiven. Sometimes it was about becoming useful in ways that honored the dead without being consumed by them. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Why did the ending feel less like a finish line and more like a quiet place to stand? The last week of the training cycle arrived without announcement. No ceremony, no countdown, just a subtle shift in how everyone moved, like the air itself understood something was closing. Raina noticed it in the trainees first. Their jokes came less easily. Their movements were sharper but more restrained. They weren't trying to prove anything now. They were trying not to fail the people beside them. That mattered more than any metric she could write on a board. She stood in the observation booth one morning before sunrise, watching silhouettes move through a drill she'd rewritten months earlier. Uncertainty baked into every decision, conflicting information, a choice that couldn't be undone once made. She didn't intervene. She let the scenario breathe. When it ended, she saw what she'd hoped for, not perfection but accountability. They talked to each other. They owned mistakes without deflection. She felt something settle in her chest, not relief, alignment. Holloway joined her without comment, coffee steaming in the cold. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the reset. After a long moment, he said the class was better than the last, better than several before that. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. Why did acknowledgement feel heavier than praise? The final evaluation day came with weather that matched the mood. Low clouds, cool air, light wind carrying the smell of the ocean. The trainees lined up, faces drawn, gear checked and rechecked. Raina walked the line once, meeting eyes, offering nothing more than presence. They didn't need speeches. They needed steadiness. As the day unfolded, she watched them succeed and fail in small, human ways. A hesitation corrected. A mistake recovered. One trainee tapped out quietly, tears streaking through grime, apologizing to no one in particular. She knelt beside him, told him stopping was also a decision, one that took courage. He nodded, broken but honest. That night the base felt different. Less noise, more space. Raina returned to her quarters and sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, uniform stiff with salt and sweat. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't need to. She took out the photograph. For a long time she just held it. The faces hadn't changed. They never would. But she had. She saw it now, in the lines around her eyes, in the way her hands no longer shook when she was still. The promise she'd made in Mosul no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a thread running through her life, pulling her forward when she might otherwise have stopped. Why did letting go feel like betrayal, even when it was? Sleep came unevenly. Dreams brushed close but didn't fully form. When she woke, it was before dawn, the world washed in gray. She dressed slowly, deliberately, and stepped outside. The air was cool enough to bite. She welcomed it. She walked toward the training grounds alone. No agenda, no clipboard, just movement. The obstacle field was empty now, mud drying into cracked patterns. She thought about the first morning she'd stood there, ignored and assessed without consent. She felt no anger toward that memory, only distance. Change didn't erase the past, it contextualized it. Later that morning, the trainees gathered one last time, not for accolades, for transition. Names were read, assignments hinted at, futures sketched in broad strokes. When it was over, they broke formation without instruction, standing awkwardly, unsure what to do with the space left behind. One by one, a few approached her, not to thank her, not formally, just to nod, to say they'd remember certain things, angles, breathing, silence. She nodded back. That was enough. Why did endings always reveal what beginnings hid? Holloway found her after most people had dispersed. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Orders, extension approved. He said the command hoped she'd stay. The word hope sat strangely between them. She told him she would, for now. He hesitated, then said something he hadn't practiced, that his daughter had decided to reapply, that watching this cycle had changed how he talked to her. He didn't frame it as gratitude, just information. She received it with the respect it deserved. That evening, Raina finally unpacked the last of her sea bag, not because she planned to stay forever, because she planned to be present. She placed the photograph in a drawer this time, not hidden, just at rest. She touched the compass rose behind her ear and let her hand fall away. Why did peace feel so unfamiliar when it finally arrived? It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in small permissions, allowing herself to sit without scanning exits, letting laughter exist without waiting for consequence, accepting that purpose didn't have to be painful to be real. She wrote one last note in her notebook that night, not analysis, not planning, just a sentence she didn't want to forget. Promises don't end, they evolve. She closed the notebook and turned off the light. Outside, the base settled into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere, trainees slept before being sent into futures she'd helped shape but would never fully know. Somewhere else, a memory loosened its grip just enough to allow room for tomorrow. Raina lay back and stared into the dark, breathing steady, shoulders heavy but grounded. She didn't feel finished. She felt aligned. And for the first time since Mosul, that was enough. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.